The sky above the mountains was an endless expanse of gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy with the promise of snow. Mark led the way up the narrow trail, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. Behind him, Lisa and Sophie exchanged jokes to keep the mood light, while Tom lagged a few paces behind, muttering complaints about the biting wind. It was Sophie who spotted it first, a jagged peak rising just above the tree line, its silhouette oddly angular against the backdrop of nature's chaos. "What is that?" she asked, pointing ahead. Her voice trembled, though whether from cold or unease, she couldn't tell. Mark squinted. "Looks like a camp? Could be from one of those mountaineering groups." The group pressed on, curiosity overriding their exhaustion. When they finally reached the clearing, they were greeted by a scene that made them all pause. The camp lay in shambles. Tents, once vibrant, were now faded and torn as if slashed by claws. Gear was scattered everywhere. Ice axes, climbing ropes, and personal belongings half buried in the snow. A single lantern hung from a skeletal tree branch, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. "Looks like they left in a hurry," Tom said, kicking at a fallen thermos. It rolled a few feet before stopping against something half buried in the snow. He crouched to retrieve it, a leather-bound journal, its edges stiff with frost. Lisa moved closer, wrapping her arms around herself. "Maybe we should turn back. This place feels wrong." Mark ignored her. He opened the journal, thumbing through its brittle pages. The handwriting was erratic, scrawled in a rush. Words jumped out at him. "Lights whispers they're coming." He read aloud, voice steady despite the growing tension. "Whispers," Sophie repeated, her breath visible in the cold air. She glanced around nervously at the encroaching forest. Mark closed the journal and set his jaw. "We'll stay the night. Maybe there's something here worth finding out." Sophie wanted to protest, but the words died in her throat. She had the sudden, chilling sensation that they were being watched. From the shadows at the forest's edge, something shifted. Darkness descended faster than any of them anticipated, the mountains swallowing the last light of day. Mark and Tom worked quickly to set up their tents, while Lisa and Sophie gathered wood for a fire. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that sank into their bones and lingered, no matter how many layers they wore. The campfire crackled, its warmth an inadequate shield against the vast, oppressive silence surrounding them. Mark stared into the flames, his mind turning over the entries in the journal. Lisa, ever the optimist, was attempting to lighten the mood with a story about her college days, but even she sounded unconvincing. Tom picked at his nails, his skepticism worn thin by the eeriness of their surroundings. Sophie sat apart, her back to the fire, watching the tree lean. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending and twisting in ways that defied the flickering firelight. She felt it again, the sensation of being observed, as if unseen eyes were trained on them from the darkness. "Anyone else feel like we shouldn't be here?" she finally said, her voice soft but carrying in the silence. Mark looked up, shaking himself out of his thoughts. "It's just an old camp, probably animals that wrecked the place. We'll get some rest and leave first thing in the morning." Tom snorted. "Yeah, and the whispers in that journal? Just some scared mountaineer losing his mind." Before Mark could respond, a sound pierced the quiet, a scream. Distant, high-pitched, and unmistakably human. It rose and fell, then abruptly stopped, leaving the group frozen. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her cheerful mask cracking. Mark stood, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. "Probably a fox," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Tom nodded, latching onto the explanation. "Yeah, foxes scream like that. Nothing to worry about." Sophie shivered. That didn't sound like a fox. The group fell silent again, their unease growing with every passing minute. When Sophie finally suggested taking shifts to keep watch, no one argued. The first shift was uneventful, though Mark found his nerves fraying under the weight of the stillness. When it was Sophie's turn, she huddled close to the fire, trying to ignore the faint whispers she thought she heard in the wind. "Just your imagination," she told herself. But when it was Lisa's shift, the real terror began. She sat near the fire, her eyes heavy with fatigue, when she heard the soft crunch of snow. She froze, straining to see beyond the dim glow of the campfire. A figure was moving between the tents, slow, deliberate, almost gliding. "Mark," she hissed, but there was no response. The figure stopped, its shadow stretching impossibly tall against the side of a tent. Then, with a flicker, it vanished. Lisa scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she scanned the camp. She was about to wake the others when she noticed something new: footprints in the snow. They led toward her tent, but there were no return tracks. The fire sputtered, and the shadows grew longer. Morning brought little relief. The sky was dull and overcast, casting a pale, anemic light over the camp. None of them had slept well. Mark, due to his worries about the journal, Sophie, plagued by nightmares, and Lisa, haunted by the strange events during her watch. Tom, however, seemed unusually subdued. "What's with you?" Mark asked as they huddled around a hastily made breakfast. Tom didn't respond right away. He sat apart, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "I saw something last night." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Saw what?" It was Tom trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind. It's nothing." Sophie leaned closer, her face pale and drawn. "You saw it, didn't you? The figure?" Tom looked up sharply, his eyes darting to hers. "How do you know that?" "Because I felt it," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Lisa saw the footprints. Something is here with us." "Enough," Mark snapped, standing abruptly. "We're all sleep-deprived and freaking ourselves out. Let's focus on getting our gear together and heading back down. The weather's turning, and we don't need more complications." No one argued, but the tension between them was palpable. As they worked to dismantle their camp, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the occasional crunch of snow or the metallic clink of gear. Tom volunteered to collect firewood for the descent, an excuse to escape the group's charged atmosphere. "I'll be back in 10 minutes, he called over his shoulder. But he didn't come back. At first, Mark dismissed it as Tom dragging his feet. Typical. But when 20 minutes passed, the concern in Sophie's eyes became too much to ignore. "We have to look for him," she urged. Mark nodded reluctantly. "Stay together. Keep your flashlights on." The three ventured into the woods, following Tom's footprints in the snow. They twisted and turned erratically, as if he'd been wandering in circles. The prints led to the base of a large tree, then abruptly stopped. Lisa scanned the area, her hands trembling. "Where is he? There's no way he could just disappear." Sophie pointed at the tree. "Look!" Carved deep into the bark was one of the strange symbols they'd seen scattered around the camp. This one was larger and more intricate, with jagged lines radiating outward like a starburst. The sight of it filled them with a primal unease. Mark moved closer, studying the symbol with a frown. Could he have carved this? Maybe he's messing with us. "Tom doesn't know how to carve things like this," Sophie said, her voice rising in panic. "And even if he did, why would he?" "Something's wrong." Lisa stepped back, her breath quickening. "We need to leave. Now!" A sound echoed through the forest. A low, guttural murmur, like voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding them. "Tom!" Lisa called, her voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Then, from deeper in the forest, they heard him. "Help me." The voice was faint and strained, but unmistakably Tom's. Mark's flashlight beam swung wildly as he tried to locate the source. "Tom, where are you?" Mark shouted. "Help!" The voice repeated, fainter this time. Sophie grabbed Mark's arm. "Don't! It's not him! What are you talking about?" Mark barked, yanking his arm free. "I don't know what it is, but it's not him." Sophie's eyes were wide with fear. Lisa took a step toward the sound. "We can't just leave him. He's out there. He's scared." No, Sophie's voice was firm, resolute. "If we go after that voice, none of us are coming back." Mark hesitated, torn between his rational mind and the fear gnawing at his gut. "We'll circle back to camp," he decided. "We need a better plan." As they turned to retrace their steps, Sophie stopped suddenly, her flashlight flickering over a new set of footprints. These were larger than Tom's, with a strange, elongated shape, and they didn't belong to any of them. The footprints led away from the tree, back toward the direction of their camp. The group hurried back to camp, their unease growing with every step. The footprints, the elongated alien imprints, seemed to multiply, crisscrossing their path and veering in directions that defied logic. It felt as though something unseen was stalking them, playing with them. When they reached the clearing, their camp seemed different, as though subtly rearranged. The tents were there, the fire pit untouched, but something was off. Sophie was the first to notice the symbols. They were everywhere now, on the tents, the ground, even carved into the rocks surrounding the camp. Each one was intricate and jagged, radiating an energy that made Sophie's skin crawl. "These weren't here before," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lisa stared at the carvings, her cheerful facade long since shattered. "It's like they're multiplying." Mark, ever the rational leader, knelt to examine one of the symbols on the ground. "This is impossible. We've been gone for what? Half an hour? No one could have done this so quickly." "Maybe it wasn't someone," Sophie said quietly. Mark shot her a sharp look. "Enough with the paranoia. Let's figure this out logically." Before he could say more, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The sound seemed to carry voices, faint and disjointed, like a chorus of whispers just out of earshot. The fire flickered, threatening to extinguish. "We need to leave," Lisa said firmly. Her voice wavered, but her tone was resolute. "Tom's gone, and this place is wrong. We have to go. Now." "We can't leave him," Mark insisted. "He's out there somewhere." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but Sophie interrupted. "If we stay, we're going to end up like them." She gestured toward a pile of scattered belongings near the edge of the clearing. Among them was a camera bag, half buried in the snow. Sophie picked it up and unzipped it, revealing an old camcorder. She hesitated before pressing the power button. Remarkably, it still worked. "What's on it?" Lisa asked, crowding close. Sophie fast-forwarded through several clips of the previous mountaineering group. At first, the footage was mundane. Hikers smiling at the camera, trudging through snow, setting up their camp. Then, the tone shifted. The screen showed the hikers huddled around their campfire at night, their faces pale and strained. One of them, a bearded man with wide, frantic eyes, spoke directly to the camera. "Do not leave any tracks," he said, his voice shaking. "No footprints, no trails. If they follow, you're done for." "What is he talking about?" Lisa whispered, her breath fogging the cold air. The footage continued, now showing the hikers frantically erasing their tracks, sweeping the snow with branches. The camera jerked suddenly, the image tilting as the person filming turned toward the trees. A low rumbling sound filled the audio, growing louder and louder until it drowned out the hikers' panicked screams. The video ended abruptly. Mark stared at the screen, his face pale. "This doesn't prove anything. They could have been." "Mark," Sophie interrupted, her voice trembling. "Look." She pointed to the ground near the edge of the clearing. There, in the freshly fallen snow, were their own footprints. But as they watched, the edges of the tracks began to blur, as though the snow itself was shifting. Within moments, the footprints were gone. "Tell me you just saw that," Lisa whispered. Mark's expression hardened, but he couldn't deny what they'd just witnessed. "Pack up. We're leaving. Now!" As they scrambled to gather their gear, the whispers grew louder, almost conversational, as though whatever was out there was deciding their fate. Sophie's flashlight flickered, the beam catching a glimpse of something just beyond the treeline. It was tall and humanoid, but impossibly thin, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to freeze Sophie in place. "Guys," she choked out. The others turned just in time to see the figure vanish into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint imprint of its elongated footprints. Night fell again, blanketing the clearing in an oppressive darkness. The group hadn't managed to leave the camp. Every attempt to pack their gear was thwarted by something. Their tracks being erased, the feeling of being watched, and, worst of all, the oppressive whispers that followed their every move. Lisa sat close to the fire, the glow casting sharp shadows across her face. Her usual cheer had dissolved into silence, her hands trembling as she gripped the camcorder like a lifeline. "We should watch the rest," she murmured. "There might be something we missed. More cryptic warnings and screams." Mark snapped, his patience fraying. "How's that going to help?" Sophie, pale and jittery, nodded in agreement with Lisa. "We need to know what we're dealing with. Whatever happened to them, it's happening to us." With a reluctant sigh, Mark moved closer to the fire. Lisa rewound the tape to the final moments of the last hiker's footage. As the video played, the group huddled together, the firelight flickering against the screen. The bearded man reappeared, the camera shaking as he filmed himself. His eyes darted nervously to the tree lean behind him. "It doesn't want us here," he whispered. "It's old. It's everywhere. If you're watching this, you have to." The camera jerked violently, the man's face twisting in terror. The frame filled with darkness, and a guttural roar erupted from the speakers. It was a sound that wasn't entirely animal, nor human. It was primal, layered, and soul-piercing. The video cut to black. No one spoke. The roaring sound seemed to linger in the air, even after the video ended. Sophie hugged her knees to her chest, her breath shallow. "It's hunting us." "Stop," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. He stared at the dark screen as if willing it to explain itself. "There has to be a logical explanation for all of this." Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling. "The footprints, the symbols, that thing in the trees." "Mark, we're past logic." Suddenly, the camcorder's screen flickered back to life on its own, the display full of static. For a moment, the static seemed to form shapes, human shapes, shifting and writhing in agony. Then a new image emerged, the camera panning across a dark, snowy expanse. This time it wasn't the hiker's footage. The angle was different, as though something else was holding the camera. The lens focused on a single set of fresh footprints in the snow, footprints identical to the elongated ones they'd seen earlier. The camera began following the trail, the crunching of snow audible but oddly distorted, as if being played in reverse. The video stopped abruptly, cutting to a blank screen. "That's us," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's watching us." Mark shot to his feet, pacing in agitation. "We need to get out of here now. Forget Tom. Forget the gear. We're leaving." "But the tracks," Lisa said. "If it erases them, how do we?" "I don't care," Mark shouted. "We'll head downhill and keep moving until we're far away from this cursed place." As the others reluctantly nodded, the fire sputtered violently, the flames leaping high before extinguishing in an instant. They were plunged into darkness, and then came a sound. It started as a low hum, building into a resonant, rhythmic thrum that shook the ground beneath their feet. From the trees surrounding the clearing, the whispers swelled into a cacophony, overlapping, chaotic, unintelligible. Lisa fumbled for her flashlight, the beam catching movement at the edge of the camp. A figure, a silhouette impossibly thin and elongated, emerged from the shadows, standing just beyond the range of the light. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It was watching them. "Run," Sophie whispered. Her voice trembled, but her feet were already moving. "Run!" The group bolted, their flashlights slicing through the darkness as they sprinted downhill. The snow beneath their feet seemed to shift, softening into something more like quicksand, pulling at their boots and sapping their strength. The whispers followed, growing louder, more distinct, as though the trees themselves were speaking in a language just beyond comprehension. Lisa was the first to stumble. She fell hard, her flashlight clattering away into the darkness. Mark skidded to a halt, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. "Keep moving," he barked, though his voice betrayed his panic. Sophie stopped a few feet ahead, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "We can't keep running," she panted. "It's hurting us." "Hurting us where?" Mark snapped, his frustration boiling over. Lisa's voice broke through the chaos, sharp and panicked. "Where's Tom?" The question hung in the air like a noose. They hadn't heard his voice again since the trees, and none of them had dared to look back. Mark's jaw tightened. "Forget Tom. He's gone. We need to focus on getting out of here." "You're just giving up on him?" Lisa's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face despite the cold. "He's right," Sophie said quietly. "Tom's gone, and if we don't keep moving, we'll be next." The words sent a shiver through them, a cold truth none of them wanted to face. Without another word, they pressed on, their breaths ragged, their movements frantic. The forest grew denser, the trees looming taller, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Mark stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight on the ground. The others crowded around, their hearts sinking as they saw what he was staring at. The snow beneath them was untouched. No tracks, no sign that they had run at all. "It's messing with us," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark's face was pale, his rational mind failing him. No, this can't be. We've been moving. It's like we're not even here," Sophie said. "Like we're trapped in its space." Lisa whimpered, her hands clutching the camcorder tightly against her chest. "This is my fault. I shouldn't have watched the video." "Stop it," Mark snapped. "It's not your fault. None of this is our fault." The whispers swelled again, louder this time, more insistent. Sophie clapped her hands over her ears, her flashlight falling to the ground as she crumpled to her knees. "It's inside my head," she sobbed. "It knows everything, every thought, every fear." Mark knelt beside her, grabbing her shoulders. "Sophie, listen to me. You're stronger than this. You're stronger than it. Stay with me, okay?" Lisa backed away, her flashlight beam catching movement in the trees. The elongated figure stood there again, motionless and silent, just watching. Its very presence sent waves of nausea through her. "Guys," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "It's here." Mark and Sophie turned, their flashlights joining Lisa's to illuminate the figure. It took a single jerking step forward, the movement utterly wrong, as though it didn't understand how bodies should move. "Run!" Mark shouted, but Sophie grabbed his arm. "No," she said, her voice steadier now. "If we run, it'll chase us. That's what it wants. So what do we do?" Lisa cried, her voice cracking. Sophie didn't answer. She stared at the figure, her lips trembling as the whispers seemed to coalesce into words she could almost understand. We face it." Mark stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "What the hell are you talking about?" "We can't leave tracks," Sophie said, her eyes locked on the creature. "But if we don't move, it can't follow. It can't hunt what doesn't run." The creature took another step forward, its elongated body shifting unnaturally. Mark hesitated, his instincts warring with Sophie's desperate logic. "Stay still," Sophie said, her voice firm now. "No matter what, don't move." The whispers grew deafening, the air thick with their weight. The creature loomed closer, its towering form casting a shadow that stretched impossibly far. And then it stopped. The creature stood at the edge of the light, its form flickering like a broken projection. Its elongated limbs twitched, as if testing the air. The whispers swirled around it, growing louder, more frantic, as though whatever force controlled it was deciding whether to advance. Mark's hand was clenched around the strap of his backpack, his knuckles white. Lisa's breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, her fingers trembling as she gripped the camcorder. Sophie remained still, her eyes locked on the creature, every muscle in her body tensed like a coiled spring. "Don't move," Sophie whispered, barely audible over the rising whispers. "No matter what it does." The creature tilted its head at an unnatural angle, as if studying them. Its shadow stretched forward, reaching for them like blackened tendrils. Mark wanted to back away, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he forced himself to stay rooted. Then, without warning, the creature's head snapped toward Lisa. She gasped, her grip on the camcorder faltering. The whispers surged, a chaotic cacophony that seemed to converge on her. The creature's shadow moved first, slithering across the snow, its jagged edges clawing toward her feet. "I can't," Lisa stammered, her knees buckling. "Lisa!" Sophie hissed. Lisa stumbled back, and that was all it took. The creature lunged, its limbs stretching unnaturally, closing the distance between them in an instant. Lisa screamed as it reached for her, its shadow enveloping her like a suffocating shroud. Mark acted on instinct. He grabbed the nearest rock and hurled it at the creature. The rock passed through it, as though it were made of mist, but the creature paused, its head jerking toward him. "Run!" Mark shouted, his voice breaking. "Go now!" Sophie hesitated, torn between running and helping Lisa, but the decision was made for her. The creature turned back to Lisa, its form twisting, enveloping her completely. Her screams became muffled, then abruptly ceased. "Lisa!" Mark yelled, but she was gone. Sophie grabbed his arm, pulling him backward. "We can't save her," she said, her voice breaking. "We have to go." The two of them turned and ran, their boots slipping on the uneven snow. The whispers followed, an omnipresent force that pressed against their minds, their lungs, their very existence. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees growing denser, the shadows longer. "This way!" Sophie shouted, veering toward what looked like an open clearing. But the clearing wasn't empty. The symbols were there, carved into the snow itself, glowing faintly with a sickly, unnatural light. Sophie skidded to a halt, her breath hitching. Mark slammed into her, both of them falling into the snow. The whispers surged, and the air grew heavier. The creature was behind them, its form a mass of writhing limbs and shadows. It didn't move toward them. It didn't need to. The symbols began to pulse, and Mark realized with dawning horror that the clearing itself was a trap. "We have to move," he said, grabbing Sophie's arm. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We can't go back. It's everywhere." The ground beneath them began to vibrate, the snow melting into a slushy mire. From the center of the clearing, a second figure began to rise. This one was smaller, its form less defined, but its presence was just as overwhelming. It let out a low, guttural growl that resonated deep in their chests. Mark pulled Sophie to her feet. "Then we go through." She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Through? Are you insane? Do you have a better idea?" Mark snapped, already moving. Sophie hesitated for only a moment before following. They darted through the clearing, the symbols flaring brighter with each step. The second figure reached for them, its shadow stretching impossibly far, but Mark and Sophie moved faster, their fear driving them forward. They reached the far side of the clearing, the symbols fading behind them. The whispers dimmed, but the presence of the creature lingered, a weight pressing on their every step. They didn't stop running. They couldn't. Mark and Sophie stumbled deeper into the forest, the snow swirling around them like a storm of ash. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of wind a whispered warning. Their breath came in harsh gasps, mingling with the oppressive silence that closed in around them. "We can't keep this up," Sophie panted, clutching at a stitch in her side. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. Mark glanced over his shoulder. The creature wasn't visible, but its presence lingered, an intangible weight that sapped their strength and filled the air with dread. "We have to," he said grimly. Stopping isn't an option. Ahead of them, the trees began to thin. Sophie's heart leaped with hope. A way out. Mark hesitated. The thinning forest didn't lead to open ground, but to a cliff. A jagged precipice loomed, its edge barely visible through the gloom. Below it stretched an expanse of icy fog that seemed to shimmer with movement, though nothing could be seen. "Great," Sophie muttered. "Trapped." Mark ignored her sarcasm, scanning their surroundings. The whispers had grown faint, but he could still feel them, pressing against his mind like an intrusive thought he couldn't shake. "It's not over," he muttered. "It's waiting." Sophie's eyes darted around the trees, her hands trembling. "For what?" The answer came in the form of a sound, soft at first, like a single breath, then louder, growing into a bone-chilling wail that echoed across the forest. The shadows in the tree-line began to writhe, and the creature emerged, its elongated limbs moving with an unnatural, stuttering grace. It didn't charge. It didn't lunge. It simply stood there, watching them. "It's playing with us," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. It's toying with us before it. No, Mark interrupted. His voice was calm, but his hands were shaking. It's cornering us. Sophie turned to him, her face pale with fear. Then what do we do? Mark didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the cliff's edge. For a moment, she thought he was considering jumping, but then his expression hardened. He looked back at Sophie, something unreadable in his eyes. You have to go. What? She asked, her voice sharp. No, I'm not leaving you. You have to, he insisted, stepping closer. It's me it wants. I'm the one it's been watching. That's insane, Sophie snapped. We don't know what it wants. And even if you're right, I'm not letting you. I'm not asking, Mark said firmly. His voice cracked, betraying his fear, but he forced himself to stay calm. All distracted. You take the cliff. Climb down. Find another path. Just keep moving. Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I'm not doing this, Mark. We stick together. We'll figure it out. You'll die if you stay, he said softly. This thing doesn't stop. It won't stop. The wailing grew louder, and the creature took a slow, deliberate step forward. Sophie could feel its gaze on her, cold and unrelenting, like the weight of an endless winter. I won't make it alone, Sophie whispered. I can't. Yes, you can, Mark said. He stepped past her, placing himself between her and the creature. You're stronger than you think. Now go. Sophie hesitated, her body trembling, torn between the instinct to stay and the desperate need to survive. But Mark didn't give her a choice. He turned and shouted at the creature, his voice raw with anger and fear. You want me? Come and get me. The creature moved. Its form seemed to blur as it surged forward, its shadow expanding to swallow the ground. Sophie screamed, but Mark didn't look back. Go, he roared. With a sob, Sophie turned and ran toward the cliff. She dropped to her knees, gripping the icy edge and searching for handholds. Behind her, Mark's voice rang out, defiant and desperate, as he taunted the creature. Then his voice stopped. The whispers surged, louder than ever, a chorus of inhuman voices that filled Sophie's head as she began to climb. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her fingers were numb, her body shaking, but she kept moving, clinging to the jagged rock as if her life depended on it. Because it did. Sophie climbed down the cliff until her hands were raw and her muscles screamed in protest. The whispers faded the farther she descended, replaced by the howling wind and the distant creak of shifting ice. Finally, her boots touched solid ground, a narrow, frozen expanse that stretched away into the fog. She collapsed onto her knees, choking back sobs as the full weight of what had happened settled over her. Mark was gone. Lisa was gone. Tom, too. She was alone now, and the oppressive silence of the wilderness felt like a living thing, pressing in around her. Keep moving, she whispered to herself. Her voice sounded foreign, hollow, but it spurred her to action. She picked herself up and stumbled forward, her flashlight flickering weakly in the cold. The air was thick, filled with a biting chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The forest above was no longer visible, swallowed by the fog and the cliff's overhang. Sophie followed the base of the rock wall, hoping it would lead to some kind of trail or path. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, she found nothing, only the endless expanse of snow and stone. Her flashlight began to dim, and with it, her hope. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a distant memory. She froze, clutching her arms to her chest. No, she whispered. Not again. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She spun around, her eyes darting wildly through the fog. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, shifting just out of reach. Her breath quickened, the cold air burning her lungs. Sophie. She turned toward the voice, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Mark's voice, faint but unmistakable. Mark, she called, her voice cracking. Sophie. The voice came again, closer this time, tinged with an eerie distortion. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. But then she saw it, an outline in the fog, humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements stilted and jerky. It wasn't Mark. The whispers erupted into a cacophony, filling her head with overlapping voices. They spoke her name, her fears, her memories. Every doubt, every failure, every moment she wished she could forget. It was inside her mind, peeling back the layers like pages in a book. "Leave me alone," she screamed, clutching her head. The shadows closed in, and Sophie fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She thought of Mark, of Lisa, of Tom, of the life she had before this nightmare. A life that now felt impossibly far away. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint light. It pulsed weakly through the fog like a dying star. Sophie's heart leaped. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward it, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the shadows, ignoring the cold that bit at her heels. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a narrow crevasse in the rock wall. Without hesitation, she squeezed through, her body scraping against the icy stone. On the other side, the light became blinding, and she had to shield her eyes. When she opened them, she was standing in a clearing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural stillness. The ground was covered in symbols, carved into the snow, glowing faintly with the same sickly light she'd seen before. In the center of the clearing was an object, half buried in the snow. It was the camcorder. Sophie hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But something compelled her forward. She knelt and picked up the device, its surface icy cold. The screen flickered to life, displaying static. Then, an image appeared. It was her. She was standing in the clearing, holding the camcorder, her face pale and haunted. Behind her, shadows began to emerge from the fog, growing larger, more defined. Sophie's breath hitched as she saw herself on the screen. Turning around, her eyes wide with terror. The screen went dark. Sophie dropped the camcorder and staggered back, her mind reeling. The clearing began to shift, the symbols glowing brighter. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the shadows began to take shape. She turned and ran, the fog closing in behind her. Sophie ran blindly, her legs numb, her lungs burning with each breath of icy air. The whispers were everywhere now, pressing against her mind like a tide threatening to drown her. The shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of her vision, growing closer with every step. "Please," she choked out, her voice raw. "Leave me alone." But the forest offered no solace. The fog thickened, obscuring her path, until she could no longer see her feet. She stumbled, falling hard on her knees, the impact jarring her entire body. She stayed there for a moment, trembling, the weight of exhaustion and despair pressing down on her. Then she heard it, a voice, clear and familiar. "Sophie." Her head snapped up. It was Mark's voice, soft and steady, cutting through the chaos. She turned, scanning the fog, her heart pounding. "Mark!" "Sophie, you're almost there," the voice said. It was close, impossibly close. "You can do this. Keep moving." Her breath hitched. She didn't understand how he could be alive, but she clung to the sound of his voice like a lifeline. She staggered to her feet, her legs shaking, and took a hesitant step forward. The fog seemed to part slightly, revealing a faint glow in the distance. It wasn't the sickly light of the symbols, but something softer, warmer. Hope flickered in Sophie's chest. She started toward it, her steps quickening. But the whispers surged again, louder and angrier, as though whatever force controlled them had realized her intent. The shadows moved faster now, darting between the trees, their forms becoming more distinct, humanoid, but wrong. "Don't stop," Mark's voice urged. "They can't follow you if you reach the light." Sophie gritted her teeth and pushed forward, her body screaming in protest. The light grew brighter, illuminating a break in the trees ahead. She could see the edge of the forest now, the snow giving way to bare rock. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping, shouting, screaming. A shadow lunged toward her, its form towering and grotesque. Sophie screamed and dove forward, hitting the ground hard. The shadow passed inches above her, its presence sending a wave of cold through her body. She scrambled to her feet. The light now just steps away. She burst through the trees and into the clearing beyond. The light surrounded her, warm and golden, a stark contrast to the icy grip of the forest. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Sophie collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling. The warmth of the light seeped into her skin, dulling the ache in her muscles and the chill in her bones. For the first time since entering the curse camp, she felt safe. But as she lay there, gasping for breath, she realized she wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head. Mark stood a few feet away, his face calm and unreadable. He looked just as he had before they'd entered the forest, unscathed, untouched by the horrors they'd endured. But something was wrong. His eyes were too bright, his smile too perfect. "Mark," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "You made it," he said, his tone warm and reassuring. "I knew you could." She pushed herself to her knees, her gaze locked on him. How are you here? I thought you. I stayed behind so you could survive," he interrupted. "But I'm here now. It's over, Sophie. You're safe." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced around the clearing, searching for any sign of where she was, of what this place might be. The light, though warm, was too perfect, unnatural, like a scene painted in glowing hues. "This isn't real," she said, her voice firming. "You're not Mark." His smile faltered for a moment, then returned, wider this time. "You don't have to fight anymore," he said, stepping closer. "Stay here. Rest. You've earned it." Sophie scrambled back, her heart pounding. "You're not him," she repeated. "What are you?" Mark tilted his head, his smile fading. "You can't leave, Sophie. Not now. Not after everything." The light around them dimmed slightly, and the warmth began to fade. Sophie felt the cold creeping back, seeping into her skin. The whispers returned, faint and insistent, just beyond the edges of the clearing. She stood, her legs shaking but resolute. "I'm not staying here." Mark's form began to blur, his features distorting. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You're part of this now." The light flickered, and the shadows began to creep closer, spilling into the clearing like ink. Sophie turned and ran, the warmth vanishing completely as the golden glow was swallowed by darkness. Behind her, the whispers rose again, and Mark's voice called out one last time, cold and hollow. "You can never leave." But Sophie didn't stop. She didn't look back. She ran deeper into the unknown, chasing the faint hope that somewhere, somehow, escape was still possible.